Assalamu alaikum. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has been watching these videos, or to be more accurate, listening to the lectures which have been uploaded in the form of videos on the metaphysics of the healing of Ibn Sina, or the Ilahiyat from the Kitab al-Shifa of Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna. And this will be the 10th lecture, and those 10 lectures in their entirety have covered what is called al-Maqalatul Ula, which I like to translate as the first discourse, which consists of 8 chapters. In the Michael Marmura translation, he calls that Book 1, and it consists of 8 chapters. And so for the time being, we'll be concluding our classes, our lectures on the Kitab al-Shifa, the Ilahiyat, or the metaphysics of the healing. And we'll be stopping for about 2.5 months. Today's actually the 18th of June 2020, according to the Gregorian calendar. And we'll be picking up again in Book 2 of the same in about 2.5 months, in about September, inshallah. But please do stay tuned to the channel. A number of other lecture streams have been recorded. They're being edited, and they'll be uploaded gradually. And they include topics ranging from Islamic theology to irfan and tasawwuf, sophism, logic, as well as my various more informal videos on magic squares and whatnot. So I do thank everyone who has watched up to now, and if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do so. Thank you very much. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Today, I am absolutely ecstatic about the fact that in our classes on the Kitab al-Shifa, the Ilahiyat of the Kitab al-Shifa of Ibn Sina, we have reached al-Fasl al-Thamin, or Chapter 8 from al-Maqalat al-Ula from Book 1. And Chapter 8 is the last chapter in Book 1, which means that after this, we will have an exam, inshallah. Oh, yes, we will have an examination. Now, I'm not sure how we will go about it, given these stay-in-place restrictions, or whatever you call them. So maybe we'll have to make it a take-home exam, so to speak, or I'll have you write an essay or something like that, all right? But I'll think about it. So before we proceed, when would you like to have that exam? In case you're wondering, we will finish Chapter 8 today. Even though it's long, we'll finish it today.
I mean, it's probably wise sometime before Ramadan starts to have it.
So you want to have like a week or so to study?
I still have a couple to catch up on, and then we can. So the week after next week.
Mm-hmm. All right. What I will do is I will leave the two of you to think it over. and then send me, not on the group, but just privately, send me on WhatsApp or Telegram or whatever you like, what your preferred dates are, and we'll but you have to both have them on the same. It can't be, and I'll give you a couple of days since it'll be a take home. I think I'll give you 48 hours.
Sounds good.
Mm-hmm. Late submissions will not be accepted. Okay. Yeah, no, it's just, fortunately we are not within the university system and we can do whatever we like. These are my private classes, so we can do it as we like. All right, let us then dive right in. So we have al-Fasl al-Thamin, and the title he has given here is a very interesting one. So I would like to request you to pay very close attention, laser-like focus, please, on this title heading. في بيان الحق. That's pretty profound. والصدق. والذب عن أول الأقاويل في المقدمات الحقة. Now, Michael Marmura translates this as on clarifying, and then he puts in square brackets, the meaning of truth. في بيان الحق in Arabic simply means on clarifying the truth. Truth as such. In other words, in answer to the question, what is truth? Then he proceeds further to translate the rest of the title, and he says, on clarifying the meaning, the phrase the meaning is in square brackets, meaning which shows that it's been added by Marmura as the translator, on clarifying the meaning of truth. Now, truth he puts in quotation marks, and veracity. He puts that in quotation marks as well, which is how he translates the Arabic word sidq. Then he says, he has a semicolon and says defense of the primary statements in true premises. Okay, what do you think about this title? Well, I would humbly offer the suggestion that Ibn Sina here, in this concluding chapter of the first discourse, I prefer to use discourse rather than book one if you prefer, Ibn Sina is simply offering, in some ways as a kind of afterthought. I would think that these considerations would perhaps have been better placed elsewhere, earlier in the book, but he's offering, perhaps by way of an afterthought or a conclusion, his thoughts on, or his reflections on methodological problems, or he's presenting some methodological considerations in metaphysics with a view towards constructing or presenting a burhan for wajibul wujud, an apodictive proof or demonstration for the existence of necessary being. Because if you have read the chapter, then you will see that he's discussing stuff that really relate, he's discussing topics that I have discussed, for example, in our classes on logic. All right, so that means nobody read the chapter yet. So let's look at, I'm not going to go through paragraph by paragraph. We have been doing that method in the past. We stopped that as of the last chapter, chapter 7. It's taking far too long. So I'm going to try and give you, each time from now on, a kind of overview of what is being said, and then hopefully you will read it before the class, and if you have particular questions about words, terms, or actual passages in the text, we can deal with that in the Q&A. So this method of reading it all word by word, I don't think I'm going to stick to that, but we will also not completely completely stop doing that. And so I would like you to look closely at the first paragraph. Now, we are on page 38, English and Arabic both. Paragraph 1 in the English translation begins at line 25, and in Arabic it begins at line 15. أما الحق فيفهم منه الوجود في الأعيان مطلقا. As regards truth, one understands by it existence in external things absolutely. ويفهم منه الوجود الدائم, and one understands by it permanent existence. And one understands by it the state of the verbal statement or of the belief indicating the state of the external thing. ويفهم منه حال القول أو العقد الذي يدل على حال الشيء في الخارج إذا كان مطابقا له. Such that يعني فنقول هذا قول حق وهذا اعتقاد حق. Such that we would say this is a true statement and this is a true belief. So he's saying then that on this view, wajib al-wujud is the permanently true in itself. فيكون الواجب الوجود هو الحق بذاته دائما والممكن الوجود. So where does that leave the contingent? والممكن الوجود حق بغيره. Hence, possible existent would be true through another because it's wajibun بالغير and false in itself. باطل في نفسه. فكل ما سوى الواجب الوجود الواحد باطل في نفسه. Hence all things other than one necessary existent are in themselves false. وأما الحق من قبل المطابقة فهو كالصادق إلا أنه صادق فيما أحسب باعتبار نسبته إلى الأمر وحق باعتبار نسبة الأمر إليه. As for the truth by way of correspondence, it is similar to the veracious, except that as I reckon it is veracious, then considered in terms of its relation to the fact, and true when the relation of the fact to it is considered. That's a horrible translation. Veracious is not good here. It just means the true. It just means true in the sense of true false, and that it corresponds to reality. So what he is saying here in this first paragraph is that he is really offering the observation that there is a relationship, a very deep and profound relationship in the very nature of things between ontology and logic. And I think in our very first lecture on logic, in our logic classes, we talked about this intimate connection between metaphysics, specifically being, on the study of being, ontology, and logic, and ethics. And indeed, we spoke in subsequent lectures on logic on the three fundamental acts of the mind and the three fundamental laws of thought. The law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle. And indeed, in addition to those three laws of thought, two further principles which, along with those three laws of thought, come into play in syllogisms. And those two principles were, the first of them is what was called in Latin the dictum de omnia, or the principle of the all, and the dictum de nullo, the principle of the none. One being an inclusionary principle and the other being an exclusionary principle, and it is on the basis of these logical laws that the syllogism works. Now, guess what? This is all that he is talking about in the rest of this chapter. Ibn Sina is talking about the importance of the laws of logic, the laws of thought, how they relate to the syllogism, how sophistry is an irrational position, and how questions such as these, which are under investigation here in chapter 8, are properly investigated in metaphysics rather than in some other particular science. In other words, it is as if he is saying that the investigation of these connections between logic and ontology, their proper place really is in metaphysics rather than in logic. That's what is there in the two concluding paragraphs. So now if I were to put before you an outline of the 15 paragraphs of which this chapter consists, I would do it as follows. Again, an alternative heading for this chapter would be, in my humble opinion, Ibn Sina's methodological considerations with a view toward a burhan for wajib al-wujud, or with a view toward an apodictic proof for necessary being. Paragraph 1. We've just read it. Here, Ibn Sina establishes an intimate connection and relationship between ontology and logic. In paragraph 2, and these are actually rather more clear than he usually is. Paragraph 2 simply has him speaking about the importance of the law of non-contradiction. And the law of non-contradiction is among what he calls, and I quote, the statements most deserving of being called true are those whose truth is permanent. And of these, the most deserving are those whose truth is primary, requiring no cause. Now, if you go down further on page 39, line 10, he says, and he states the law of contradiction, which he's quoting from his book of demonstration, Kitab al-Burhan, the footnote is there. There is no intermediary between affirmation and negation. In Arabic, he's here speaking of, in paragraph 2 on page 39, line 3, وَأَحَقُّ الْأَقَاوِيلِ أَنْ يَكُونَ حَقًّا مَا كَانَ صِدْقُهُ دَائِمًا وَأَحَقُّ ذَلِكَ مَا كَانَ صِدْقُهُ أوليا ليس لعلة وأول كل الأقاويل الصادقة الذي ينتهي إليه كل شيء في التحليل. Then in line 6 he states it لا واسطة بين الإيجاب والسلب. So again, this is simply him arguing for the centrality, the principiality, the fundamentality of the law of non-contradiction. In paragraph 3, which begins in line 25 on page 39 of the English, and line 14 of the Arabic of the same page, in other words, page 39 in Arabic, he then talks about the truth of the syllogism. Again, in terms of the truth of the syllogism, it rests upon the three laws of thought, the laws of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, plus the dictum de omnia and the dictum de nullo. Now, he doesn't explicitly state it in those terms that I have, but that's what it boils down to. Turning now to page 40. In paragraph 4, in just a few words, he speaks of the untenable position of the sophist. The untenable position of the sophist. He speaks of that in these words: one of the astonishing things is that the sophist, whose purpose is to wrangle, is forced into one of two states of affairs, either silence and the desisting from all argument, or inescapably the acknowledging of the truth of certain things and the confession that they yield necessary conclusions against him. ومن العجائب أن السوفسطائي الذي غرضه المماراة يضطر إلى أحد الأمرين، إما إلى السكوت والإعراض، وإما إلى الاعتراف لا محالة بأشياء، والاعتراف بأنها تنتج عليه. In paragraph 5, he speaks of the person whom he refers to as al-mutahayyir. The mutahayyir is the person who is perplexed. it's not that they reject, like the sophist. The sophist rejects that there can be logical argument. The person who's perplexed is just confused. Why are they confused? Because they see educated people, indeed philosophers no less, who have disagreed with one another on topics, and then they think, well, how can this be? Let's just forget it. There can't really be any objective basis for arriving at such truths. And so then he, having introduced the position of the perplexed in paragraph 6, which is now on page 41, he speaks of the role or the responsibility of the philosopher in removing the doubts of those who are perplexed. In paragraphs 7 through 11, which run from page 41 to the end of page 42, he presents the philosopher's arguments which may be employed in the removal of the perplexity of the perplexed. In paragraph 12 on page 43, he speaks of the cure for the obdurate, al-muta'annit, the one who refuses to be convinced and rejects the law of non-contradiction. He speaks of the solution there being conflagration. You understand the term conflagration, of course. To set on fire. So he says, it's kind of funny, he says, وَأَمَّا الْمُتَعَنِّتْ فَيَنْبَغِي أَنْ يُكَلَّفْ شُرُوعَ النَّارِ إِذَا النَّارِ وَاللَّا نَارِ وَاحِدٍ. As for the obdurate, he must be subjected to the conflagration of fire, since fire and not fire are one. Now, I don't think he's obviously being serious here, right? So, if you're confronted with someone who rejects the law of non-contradiction, then you challenge him to put his hand into a flame, I imagine. So then in paragraph 13, he again reiterates the centrality of the law of non-contradiction and the need to defend it by the philosopher. Then in 14 and 15, he concludes the chapter by indicating that the foregoing considerations in paragraphs 1 through 13 are properly considered in metaphysics inasmuch as it is a universal science rather than in some other particular science. That is the summary which I can offer you, or outline or overview which I would present to you regarding chapter 8 from book 1. No, we are not done. So that's what I would offer as my summary of it, and you should go and read it if you haven't read it. If you have read it, read it again, and you will see that that is what is going on in that chapter. This is, I think, a rather straightforward one in comparison with the previous chapters we've had. And also, I think part of the reason it's a bit more straightforward, or would be more straightforward for you, is because we have covered a lot of this material in our classes on logic, and I think there even may have been some overlap in maybe the Tajreed class, or maybe not. Anyhow, so there's a few things which I would like to examine more closely for the next for the rest of the class, and those are the irrationality of the sophist position, or the untenability of a sophist or a relativist position in philosophy. And inasmuch as the previous chapter 7, was regarding the establishing of or proving the uniqueness of the necessary being, and inasmuch as the last part of chapter 6 was devoted to establishing that the necessary being has no equivalent, all of these investigations in these last 3 chapters, in other words, 6, or the end of 6, and all of 7, and then 8, all of these are investigations which are related to proving the existence of God. Now, inasmuch as in our lecture on chapter 7, we already went through a rigorous proof on the based on Ibn Sina's notion of contingency and necessity for proving the existence of God. After having considered the untenability and irrationality of the sophist or relativist position, I would like to offer you some thoughts on the impossibility of disproving the existence of God. Let me say that again. The impossibility, you did not hear me incorrectly, of disproving the existence of God. Why that is logically not possible. And this is all implicit in what Ibn Sina writes here, but he doesn't really come out. And I think that close reflection on this chapter would lead you to such a conclusion, and on deep reflection on his other writings, which parallel these investigations. I have specifically in mind the work known as al-Isharat wa Tanbihat. There's some parallelism or overlap between these books. So first of all, before we do this, are you all okay with the three laws of thought and why the syllogism works?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
That was, of course, covered in the logic. Okay. So now, what do you really understand by the sophists? I mean, it always comes up in these Islamic logic texts, as-safsata.
Mm-hmm.
What really is meant by as-safsata in Islamic logic texts, and who were the sophists as actually a group in the history of philosophy in ancient Greece? They were a group that was there in ancient Greece. But in philosophical texts in the Islamic tradition, it generally refers to people who have these extreme doubts about the possibility of truth and the possibility of knowledge.
I mean, they're kind of made out to be relativists, that they made man the barometer for truth and falsehood and all of that. At times.
Yes, you are quite right. In terms of ancient Greece, they did take a what we would today call a relativist position. Now, I think both in our class on Tajrid al-I'tiqad, and I think at one point even in our study of the Shīʿah several lectures back, we discussed in great detail relativism and postmodernism, and did we not?
We did.
That was in the Shīʿah class, I think. And there was maybe some of it in the Tajrid as well. So, sophistry or sophism and relativism have a lot in common. I really think that, the sophists were just an ancient form of relativism. So, what does that come down to? If the position of the relativist is that all truth is relative, the statement all truth is relative is equivalent to the statement that there are no absolute truths. Let me say this again. The claim of relativism, namely that all truth is relative, that proposition is equivalent to the proposition there are no absolute truths. So regardless of how you phrase it, whether you say all truth is relative or whether you say there are no absolute truths, you are saying the same thing. Now, what do you think about such a proposition from a logical point of view? My question to you, it's not a rhetorical question. Okay, no response.
Sorry, you'll have to repeat the question. My mic was a bit...
Your mic.
out.
All right, so if the claim of relativism is that all truth is relative, which is equivalent to the proposition there are no absolute truths, what can you say about these two equivalent or either of these two equivalent propositions?
I mean, if you say it's relative, then that statement itself can be taken as relative also.
Yes. What I would say is that the claim made by the relativist is itself an absolute assertion. All truth is relative. There are no absolute truths. And therefore, relativism contradicts itself.
Exactly.
And if you say that there are no such truths, and there are no logical truths as well, and that reduces to the ancient sophist notion that there isn't any truth. And so, for example, if we take the law of non-contradiction and formulate it as some proposition, let's call it capital C as in Charlie, and state it as follows. Proposition C, any proposition is either true or false. So let's now negate that proposition by some new proposition, call it C prime. Namely that the law of contradiction is false. But if C prime holds, it is true. But it cannot be, since the law of contradiction has been denied. Therefore C prime is false. So, as Ibn Sina says in the relevant paragraph in chapter 8, the sophist contradicts himself. And that is why he contradicts himself. Although Ibn Sina doesn't spell it out in that form. So much for the untenability of the sophist, of the position of the sophists and the relativists. Now, if you want more detail, then there is a huge amount of detail in the relevant lecture which we gave on the Shīʿah. I'm sorry at the moment, I don't remember which one it was. It was one of the early ones when we were still able to meet in person. And it was a really long one, as I recall. And both of you kind of got tired, but anyway, it's there in the recordings. So now, I would like to move on to my next topic. Having dealt with the untenability of the sophist and relativist position in summary form, I will now go into detail regarding the irrationality and the untenable nature of the atheist position, the tenuous rationality of the atheist claim. Now, the atheists who are more clever than who? Well, the atheists who are more clever than the so-called new atheists with a capital N and a capital A, namely the likes of Richard Dawkins, who is the most famous and shrill member of that club, and who has been promoted and lionized by the world media, along with Christopher Hitchens, who is now deceased, Daniel Dennett, and one other fellow. What is his name? American fellow. What's his name? He's author of Letter to a Christian Nation. His name.
Yeah, it slips my mind also at the moment.
No, it's there. Is Sam something? Samuel Harris.
Sam Darnold.
No, Harris, not Arnold. Harris.
Sam Harris.
So the more clever atheists realize that it's not possible to disprove the existence of God. They actually know this. And really, the best book and the most readable book by an atheist on atheism that actually has some grasp of the philosophical challenges is by George H. Smith, Atheism, the Case Against God. And he's quite savvy, and he goes about by saying that atheism really has to be defined as absence of theistic belief. And so he says that atheism has this negative character. And in fact, he says that atheism, and I quote, is a privative term, a term of negation indicating the opposite of theism. If we take the phrase belief in God as a substitute for theism, we see that its negation is no belief in God, or in other words, atheism. So for him, atheism is the absence of belief in God. The quotation which I just read is from that book, page 7. Sorry, page 8 from the book Atheism, the Case Against God. So he recognizes that you can't really disprove the existence of God. So he says that the burden of proof then lies not on the atheist, but on the theist. But most atheists don't understand this. And aside from formal debate with qualified adversaries, with qualified interlocutors from the atheist camp, when you're just talking about the average person wrongly, from a logical point of view, from the point of view of logic and metaphysics, wrongly believes, due to the prevailing zeitgeist of scientism. Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, is a German word used in English. This prevailing spirit of the times of scientism, in which, due to the stunning technological gifts that result from modern science and the scientific method, we no longer need God, or God's existence has been thoroughly discredited because religion has been thoroughly discredited. Because you have to remember that in the context of the history of Western civilization, the Catholic Church in particular played a very negative role towards experimentation and modern science and so forth. And these things are well known. But to return to our theme, in terms of logic and metaphysics, what can we really say about this idea of disproving the existence of something, specifically the disproving of the existence of God? So how do you prove something or disprove something? In this kind of metaphysical argument, in terms of logical arguments, if you want to establish the existence of something, or establish the non-existence of something, there are some rigorous standards. There are various ways of going about it. And in fact, it all boils down to 3 different ways or methods. The first of these is a rigorous kind of public corroboration. The second of these is the establishing of some kind of intrinsic contradiction. In other words, if we wanted to prove that God doesn't exist, we have to show that there is some sort of intrinsic contradiction in the notion of God. That there is some kind of an inherent contradiction in the concept of God. And the third would be establishing some kind of contradiction of fact. In other words, that if we want to show that God doesn't exist, we have to show that the existence of God would result in some contradiction of fact or facts. So let us examine these one by one. If you want to talk about rigorous corroboration, So let's take the example of unicorns. Now, do you think unicorns exist?
Mentally.
Yeah, they have a mental existence. But as an actual one-horned creature, maybe they existed at some point, but there's no such anything in the fossil record that we know of, as far as at least that I know of. So there's some sort of an animal which is mythical. And if on the off chance it did exist at one time, it's now extinct. But let's say you meet someone who believes in unicorns. All right? And he says, all right, well, prove to me that unicorns do not exist. Then we would have to have sort of the whole range of human experience before us for a rigorous kind of corroboration that unicorns don't exist. And so we can say, well, we've never ever come across unicorns anywhere. There's no human experience of unicorn. It's all mythology. And so there it might be useful. It might actually work. Or if someone says, I believe that, there are tyrannosauruses still. Well, there's no evidence whatsoever. The entire world has been mapped and explored and so on and so forth. We're not living in Europe in the Middle Ages before the European discovery of America. The world has been mapped and so forth. And it is true that there are certain species and so forth that are discovered from time to time, various organisms that we weren't aware of. But there are no dinosaurs anywhere in the world now. They have gone extinct. But what if we wanted to use such a method to prove or disprove the existence of God? The problem is that God, in principle anyway, is beyond human experience. To truly experience God. On the other hand, we do have plenty of examples of accounts of people speaking of some sort of experience of God. But then we have to understand, well, what do you mean by an experience of God? Somebody says he saw Jesus. Somebody says he sees an apparition of Mary. And for some people, these are God or aspects of God or something, according to the relevant Christian belief. Catholics believe that Mary is the mother of God, or they believe that they had some sort of experience of God because, I don't know. But there too, atheists reject the totality of such human accounts of religious experience as being subjective, as being hallucinatory, as not subject to verification, and so on and so forth. So the first method of public corroboration is pretty useless here. I think that's quite clear. But again, to keep this grounded in Ibn Sina, we'll look at the remaining two methods. In keeping this grounded with Ibn Sina, remember that Ibn Sina has gone to great lengths in chapter 7 to establish that God is unique. And I said in the lecture on that last week, that God's absolute uniqueness also is equivalent to his is coextensive with his utter and total simplicity. So God is complete, is utter and pure simplicity. Now Ibn Sina does not develop this idea in great detail, and the person who really develops this and makes this an important cornerstone of his metaphysics and theology is Mullah Sadra, where the principle as he expounds it in Arabic, namely Basitul Haqiqa Kullul Ashya, that the simplicity of the absolute truth, or the simplicity of the utterly real, is the totality of all things. So he takes this notion of divine simplicity, and I'm speaking Mullah Sadra here, and connects it intimately with his teaching on Asalatul Wujud, which is beyond the scope of today's lecture, but is well known, I think, to the class. So keep in mind this notion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you prefer to use theological language, or al-wajib al-wujud to use ontological metaphysical terminology, is utterly and completely simple. Basitun. Fi muntaha al-basata is utter simplicity. So if then we want to prove the non-existence of God on the basis of an intrinsic contradiction in the notion of God, and for the notion of God, if we have this notion that God is utter simplicity, as was and unicity, uniqueness, as was established in chapter 7, then if we want to prove the non-existence of God, then we must establish an intrinsic contradiction. But that will fail here as well, like the previous method. Why? Because I would argue, because an intrinsic contradiction can only arise from exclusionary properties of boundaries or restrictions. Now think about this. We say, for example, that God is utterly simple. He is unique. Now, utter simplicity means that there is no multiplicity there. Uniqueness means also there is no multiplicity. But since he is utterly simple, he also cannot be defined, because there can be no genus or specific difference, because genus and specific difference is only possible when there is composition. Is that clear? And when you define something, if someone asks me to define something, and they say, for example, define for me jinn, which is very hard to do, and give me a definition which is jami' and mani'. In other words, a definition which completely encompasses and delineates the thing that I am talking about, and yet at the same time excludes it from other things so that we can distinguish it from them. That's how a definition is jami' and mani'. And a definition can only be inclusionary and exclusionary to this extent if there are boundaries or restrictions. So the definition of man excludes by its very nature the definition of, let's say, cat. Because the nature of the human being, and now instead of talking about it as a definition from the point of view of logic, think of it from the point of view of metaphysics. The quiddity of man is distinct and different from the quiddity of cat or tree. And as such, the quiddity may be seen as a kind of boundary or restriction. But God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or wajib al-wujud, is utterly simple, is basit, and therefore without any boundaries whatsoever, whether intrinsic or extrinsic. Thus, God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wajib al-wujud, is purely inclusive, and thus includes all and excludes nothing extrinsically or intrinsically. If there are no exclusionary properties intrinsic to absolute simplicity of the real, basitul haqiqa, then there can never be a basis for intrinsic contradiction. If there is no boundary or restriction, then there can be no basis for contradiction. So you cannot disprove the existence of God by trying to make an argument that the notion of God itself is intrinsically contradictory. Is that clear? I often give the example from geometry. And that is why the study of geometry, especially the book known as The Elements by the great master Euclid, is of such importance, along with the commentary by the Platonic successor. He's definitely a Khalifa in the Muslim sense of Plato, namely Proclus, who comes much later. So Proclus is in the line of heads of the academy established by Plato. So Proclus has an important commentary on Euclid. And one of the things that they discuss early on in Euclid, in his Elements, is the point, an-nuqta. Are you guys still there? I'm showing that I'm not... hello?
I am here.
Oh, you are? Okay, I don't know, something is... Anyway, we proceed. So, as I often say, an-nuqtatu al-ilmu nuqtatun katharaha al-jahilun. It's a statement ascribed to Imam Ali alayhi salam that the totality of knowledge is but a point, a dot, and has been multiplied and ramified by the ignorant. So I liked this example of the point in geometry. So if you have a point and you put the tip of the one end of the compass on that point and proceed to trace out a circle, you get a circumference. And that circumference is entirely determined by the point at the center. Yet the point at the center is nowhere on the circumference. Yet, in a certain sense, it is. And within that same circle, if you decrease the radius and draw another circle inside, you have a smaller circle, and then you can draw another circle which encompasses those two smaller circles. And you could literally draw an infinite number of circles. Yet all of them would be determined by the point at the center. And you can extend that to 3 dimensions and then and have a sphere. And a sphere within a sphere within a sphere. And if you imagine an infinite space, then any point is at the center of that infinite space. So that is an interesting geometrical analog, if you like, a way through the contemplation of the mathematical forms in geometry that lead us to an understanding of profound and deep metaphysical truths. So that point is at the center, and it never really becomes a part of the circumference. You can't say that it's at this point on the circumference, yet it determines that point. وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ. So think about that. وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ. And also, in the first khutbah of Nahj al-Balagha, what do we find there? Well, there's much food for thought, there's much material, there's much matter for reflection there. مع كل شيء لا بمقارنة وغير كل شيء لا بمزايلة. Very interesting. So these are things worth thinking about and pondering at length. So you see, this attempt to prove that God does not exist on the basis of a contradiction in the notion of God does not work. Of course, my argument builds upon the fact that we have already made a proof for the existence of necessary being, which we did in the last class, and we showed that this necessary being is utterly simple, and we showed that this necessary being is utterly unique and has no equivalent. That's already been done. Okay? So we're taking that definition, if you like, not in the strict logical sense of genus and specific difference, but just a characterization, if you will, of God, of necessary being as complete and utter simplicity. On that view, then, you cannot argue that God does not exist due to inherent or intrinsic contradiction. This leaves the third way, namely arguing against the existence of God by a contradiction of fact. this too fails. So, for example, what is it we're at stake? What is involved here? Let's say I want to show that something in the external world does not exist. Okay? I must do so by showing that it is capable of being contradicted. I'll give you an example. Consider a household kitchen container, the kind in which spices and various things are kept. If I want to show that this such and such a container, does not contain sugar, I simply have to open it and demonstrate that in point of fact, it contains something else, let's say tea, or is empty, in fact. It contains nothing at all. So in this example, the contradictory properties of, in my example, sugar and tea, or if you like, sugar and no sugar, when the container is empty, render such proof possible. So in the case of sugar and tea, the quiddity of sugar is a contradiction. It is a contradictory of tea. You understand that they are naqidan, or ضدان لا يجتمعان, right? ولا يرتفعان. Isn't that correct? So in the case of sugar and tea, it just means that sugar and tea cannot occupy in its totality the same container at the same time in the same way. So it's an instance of the law of non-contradiction. So such an argument in this example, or any example, and generally speaking, such an argument is based on the exclusionary property of boundaries or restrictions. Now, since God is basit al-haqiqa, since wajib al-wujud is basit al-haqiqa, it does not exclude any bounded or restricted being from itself. Again, imagine the dot at the center of the circle. It does not extrinsically exclude anything. Once again, وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ. Therefore, Allah, God, wajib al-wujud, cannot be contradicted by any bounded or restricted being. Any bounded or restricted existing thing, any bounded or restricted entity. Thus, la yuqal, one cannot say that if X exists or some state of affairs obtains, that God does not exist. People have made statements like, because we've discovered black holes or neutron stars or supernovae, God does not exist. Meaning we've gone, our spacecraft have gone, presumably, this is what such statements mean, have gone to the ends of these galaxies, and there's no God to be found. No God has been viewed in any telescope or in any Hubble telescope or microscope or any other instrumentation. Therefore, God does not exist. Or some state of affairs, like since we have split the atom, or we have walked on the surface of the moon, or we have plumbed the depths of the oceans, or we have invented supercomputers and AI and big data, etc., 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 therefore God does not exist. The point is that no such example of things or states of affairs can ever exclude the boundarylessness of God. So no matter where or how far human artifice or ingenuity has reached such heights that we can now, hold God's funeral, the idea that, somehow we've gotten to the point that, we can dispense with the notion of God because of some dimension of human genius or ingenuity. All such instances of things or states of affairs can never exclude the boundarylessness of God. This applies to all finitude which we find in all things, other than utter simplicity, other than wajib al-wujud, other than God, other than Allah. The boundaries of finite entities cannot exclude the infinitude of necessary being, of God, of Basitul Haqiqa. Therefore, nothing finite can ever be used to contradict the existence of God. This means nothing finite can ever serve as a basis for disproving his existence. Now, these three methods exhaust the scope of formal proof, or by the same token, they exhaust the scope of formal disproof as well. It follows, therefore, that the existence of God cannot be disproved in principle. And so we see the inherently tenuous and unstable position, rationally speaking, of atheism. So today's class has been a little short. It's almost exactly 1 hour. That's all I had to present. And I do think that this chapter of Ibn Sina is much more readable, and the outline which I gave at the very beginning of the lecture, I think, will suffice to serve as a guide for your reading. And so, with that, I will conclude this class. Wallahu a'lam.